Welcome everyone to our lunch meeting 4798, our fourth online meeting. A very special welcome to our guest speaker, our own Steve Larkins OAM, who past President Peter Neal will more formally introduce later in the meeting. Welcome also to any visiting Rotarians and other guests joining us today for our meeting. I will not mention you individually as you're visible in the list of participants for all members to see. Birthday greetings this week. We've got quite a few. We've got David Flood, whose birthday was last Monday. Tatiana Turchno yesterday. Gordon Cow today. Happy birthday, Gordon! If you're there today, Gordon has usually been joining us for these online meetings. Peter Bartels and Rob Mottram tomorrow, and also. Rob has been an active participant, so if you're there, Rob, happy birthday for tomorrow. Celebrating their anniversary this week, we've got again Rob Mottram, 42 years. Sounds, apparently the answer is always 42. Well done, Rob, that's an amazing achievement. As usual, all our important announcements will be shared via our bulletin each week. For additional MailChimp emails and also via our Facebook page and WhatsApp group. These are quite handy for the WhatsApp group in particular for last minute announcements. Last night there was an online Zoom fellowship meeting. Unfortunately, I could not attend it due to another work-related Zoom meeting commitment, which I had with one of my clients in Italy. I understand it was a good meeting, and I encourage you all to keep an eye out for these fellowship Zoom meetings in the following months. There are currently no updates or changes to our meeting arrangements, so we will continue to meet online by Zoom and also use this tool to continue to operate all other aspects of our club so that we can deliver our committed humanitarian service outcome. Again, this week, it is great to see South Australia trending quite well on the numbers of this COVID-19 spread and impact, and hopefully we can soon resume to a new normal life. Most of all, we need to know that our members and their loved ones continue to be well, and because of this, we are continually looking at ways we can remain connected. For example, last night's social fellowship meeting, it's one of these ways. But we also encourage fellowship groups to also meet via Zoom, and we're starting experimenting with from today with a new Zoom feature called breakout rooms. The idea is to add some greater level of interactivity to our online Zoom meetings by splitting participants in a smaller table-sized group where members can chat and interact with each other. After closing today's meeting, I will set up 5 breakout rooms. People will be randomly assigned to these groups, and you will need to accept an invitation to join that room. Once you join the room, you can then chat with whoever is there and continue a conversation as if you were sitting at the table. This concept will be a work in progress for a few weeks until we land on to a format that everyone is happy and comfortable with. Please keep an eye on this week's bulletin for further details on this. And lastly, a reminder that we are recording these online meetings and they will be available on our social media channels and website as a podcast in a day or so. Enjoy your lunch, whatever you have personally selected today, in the online shared company of like-minded people. Don't forget that you can still contribute to our community projects by making donations via our website. And the link is being distributed in various ways as well by the bulletin and other ways. I will now hand over to our speaker for today, past President Peter Neal.
Thanks, Andrew. Before we progress the meeting, a brief spotlight on service update. Joe Fiedler, who's looking wonderful amongst the tropical foliage. Greg pops in occasionally in the background. Joe's and her innovation team are working on the nurture kits for nurses. There is a Facebook page established, and together with Simon Drew and others, an online donation page on our website causes. If you can help, please let Joe know. A reminder to let our wellbeing team know if there are any members that you hear of who might need a call. An interesting activity in community service this week was to do with Calparam. Convener Brian Harris is working with the Calparam team, and our club is helping to provide a new all-terrain type vehicle to replace a quad bike, so that people can get around and do some of the jobs on the terrific project up there. As Adri has said, your help is appreciated with contributions to the virtual bowl and support of the community projects. And on behalf of the community service team, thank you for all of those who have actually given so far. The link's on the events page at the bottom of each week's speaker, and of course in other places. Rotarians and guests, as we approach Saturday 25 April, it's timely for us to share a moment of silent respect for those who have served this nation. So I ask you to pause for a moment's silence, please. We will remember them. Thank you all for that, and I look forward to seeing you at the front gate at dawn on Saturday. Can I now get you to switch over, if you want to the speaker view, and remind you that please feel free to add any questions in the chat section on the side of the page, or wave furiously to attract my attention during the question time, and I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions for our speaker. A couple of years ago, a group from the club were privileged in the lead up to the centenary of Armistice to go on a visit to the battlefields, led by our member, friend, tour guide and today's guest speaker. A memorable visit indeed. The region that Steve will be talking about today is the region around the area of Ypres. So in my background photo today shows the wonderful Menin Gate, complete in a moment with a photograph of our speaker delivering the ode last year. I'll let him explain the significance of the gate. But today we are moving on to 1944, where Steve will share another gripping yarn with us all. Please welcome Steve Larkins, OAM.
Thanks everyone. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen, and I'll be talking to a PowerPoint, so bear with me while I get that organised, and I'm sure somebody will tell me if I've got it wrong. Okay. Okay, we got that working?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, as Peter just mentioned, we travelled to the First World War battlefields in 2018. And that's what I normally associate that area of the world with. Flanders, cities like Lille, up to Ypres, and up into Belgium to Bruges and Brussels. But I've become aware, what I'm going to tell you now is a story that's taken 22 years to unfold. My involvement with those tours began way back in 1998, when with Doug Strain and a 70-odd soldiers, we went to France to reinter the remains of an Adelaide soldier whose remains were rediscovered by a farmer. And that was an amazing experience, and it really introduced me to all of this in a big way. At the same time, I made the acquaintance of a man in Belgium, a Belgian detective, and no Poirot jokes, please. We were at the Menin Gate, where you saw Pete's images being projected there, and the Menin Gate is symbolic of the losses that were sustained in the First World War. But the man I met was an interesting chap. He was a Belgian detective, and we've remained in contact ever since. He told me an amazing story, which I wasn't able to do much with at the time, but he had a photo of a crashed Lancaster in a property owned by his grandfather. And he told me it was Australian. And I didn't have the capacity, the knowledge, or the resources at the time to pursue that much further. But more recently I have. And so what I want to do is tell you the story of that aeroplane, the context of how it wound up there, and a bit of background on the crew, 2 of whom were South Australians. I have literally just this morning driven up to Cherryville, where I was able to get a photo of one of the crew members. So it's an extraordinary story that spans the globe and takes in 70 odd years of time and a range of circumstances that we can be very grateful we didn't have to live through. So let's get the show on the road. This is about the city of Lille in northern France. For those of you who've been that way, you'll know that it's a major junction between the rail line that goes to London, down to Paris and up to Brussels. And that's what attracted a lot of attention on the 10th and 11th of May in 1944. So I want to just put you in the time and space that we're talking about. So Britain was, as you well know, was contained, isolated and alone since May 1940, when the Nazi occupation of Europe was pretty much complete. And Britain found itself in a situation where its only capacity to take the war back to Germany, or the Nazis specifically, was via its bomber command. But it was a pretty antiquated organisation at that point in time. And they discovered a lot of lessons the hard way. They sustained very heavy losses, so they went to purely night operations. And flying aircraft at that time was beset with challenges around weather, navigation at night, and the fact that the countryside was entirely blacked out. Things started to improve in 1942. The United States joined the war, but most importantly from the RAF's point of view, it got 2 new aircraft, the Handley Page Halifax, but in particular the Avro Lancaster. Very contemporary design. It was relatively fast, had long range, and it could carry a lot of bombs. But there was this amazing technological warfare going on as well, which I'll talk to in a minute. But most importantly, by May 1944, the Allies were ready to go back to Europe. And so a raft of events were taking place in preparation for that. The actual location was still secret, but the Allies set about disabling the capacity of the Nazis to reinforce and move reinforcements around. So they set up what was called the transport plan. It was to disrupt, destroy all the key transport infrastructure. From a geographic point of view, England and Europe are pretty close, obviously, but the further north and south you go from the Channel, the trickier it gets, because the bigger the span of ocean that they have to cross. At this point in time, the Allied units that we're talking about, and specifically the Australian ones, were located at a little village called Waddington in Lincolnshire, and that map shows that relativity. D-Day is imminent. They've been assigned a whole series of targets, and they had started in particular attacking targets in France. Now, interestingly at the time, if you were an aircrew member, you had to survive 30 missions to complete a tour of operations. Up until the first week of May, raids over France only counted for 1/3. I thought, God, this is like Catch-22, where they just keep extending the number of missions that you have to complete, into infinity. And that must have been what it seemed like. Incidentally, though, by the time this raid was mounted, just a week later, they'd readjusted the circumstances, and a raid to France counted as a full mission towards the completion of a tour, which increased the morale of the troops massively, but it also shows there was a huge discordance with the understanding of what was actually going on. Okay, so Lille, that map illustrates where it is. It's just in a salient in the French border into Belgium, right at the north there. It's in what's called French Flanders. The red line is the route that the people the subject of this presentation had to take to get there. Okay, now in so doing, they had to cross the Channel, obviously, but they also had to breach the German air defence network, and that illustrates how it was set up. All those little circles indicate regions, and within that would be a whole series of measures to stop the Allied aircraft reaching their targets. The 3 that I've circled were the 3 that the aircraft in question had to penetrate that night. Now, this is where the sort of technological element comes into it. The expansion of aviation generally and all the technology that goes with it was just massive from 1939 onwards. And by this point in the war, a very sophisticated set of arrangements were in place, on both sides. The Germans had formidable air defences, but the British had their own challenges just to get there and find the target at night. So we'll touch on briefly some of those. There were 3 key forms of air defence. Searchlights, which you can see in that illustration, flak or anti-aircraft artillery, and night fighters. And they were all driven by technology. The Germans by that stage had developed their own radar. Of course, the British had their ascendance in that at the start of the war, and it's what saved them in the Battle of Britain. And Germany was very reliant on its own radar network to defend its territory. The idea of this particular period of time in raiding all these transport hubs, the Allies had set up their own particular standard operating procedure, but they were also heavily reliant on technology. They had to find the target. That centre illustration gives you a quick indication of how they did that. They, in this case, used radio direction finding, 2 intersecting beams, and with a whole lot of clever geometry and manoeuvring of electrons, they were able to pinpoint the target, and the aircraft were able to navigate to it with a much greater degree of confidence than they could previously. The bottom illustration shows an aeroplane, and it's got 2 sections of it ringed. In the centre there, inside the red circle, is a thing called H2S. It's a ground mapping radar, and basically gives the operator an image at night of what the ground looks like underneath them. So that was absolutely critical. And at the end of the aeroplane there, you see a little bump under the tail. That was another radar that was used to detect the night fighters, one of which is illustrated up the top. It too is equipped with radar, and it had a number of devices. It could actually track that radar at the back of the aeroplane there and detect it further away than the detector could detect it. So, of course, neither side knew exactly what the other had at this point in time, because the only thing they had to go on was the wreckage of aircraft if they were able to recover it. But there was a game changer in place, and that is illustrated on the right. The German aircraft were being equipped with these twin upward firing cannon, and the implications of that I'll make apparent in a minute. Okay, the people we're talking about tonight were Australian crew members of these 2 squadrons, 463 and 467. They were Royal Australian Air Force, but under command of the Royal Air Force in what was called Number 5 Group. And it was 5 Group that was tasked to attack Lille on the 10th and 11th of May. These are the VWM pages, and we're very proud of this because this links the units, which you can find in all sorts of references, but it links them to people that flew in those squadrons, and you can trace those links. If you look down the bottom right there, you'll see view 82 people on 467. You can follow those individuals up, and that number's building all the time. So anyway, we're going to talk about these 2 squadrons because for them, this was their worst night of the war. I mentioned the Lancaster, and it was a very impressive aeroplane. It equipped both those RAAF squadrons, and each one carried a crew of 7. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. Compared to the American B-17, which is the Flying Fortress, this thing was faster. It carried about 3 times the bomb load, and it had a crew of 7, whereas the American aircraft had a crew of 10. So every time you lost a bomber, the Americans would lose 10 men, and the RAAF had 7 men potentially lost. Not to put too fine a point on it, but numbers matter, and from an efficiency perspective, the Lancaster was excellent. Okay, so what they were going to do on this particular occasion is they send a force forward which marks the target, and then the main force follow up. That's important because it determined what happened that night. oops, sorry. Okay, once the order to go is given, they had a very well-established routine, and this shows the 463 Squadron mass brief, where all the guys involved would be briefed as to all the key parameters of their operation. After the mass brief broke up, all the specialists, they had radio operators, bomb aimers, navigators, the pilots themselves, and air gunners and so on, will all go off to their own briefings to get detailed information on what they were about to do. They had to know where they were in the stream. There were 500 aircraft going out this night. 85 of them were going to Lille. There's a lot of air traffic and there's a lot of hostility out there. So all of the briefings have to cover the actions that they're required to take, you know, on the occurrence of certain events. They also had to understand the geometry of what they were doing to hit their target accurately, and they were bombing France, so they did not want any civilian casualties. Precision was of utmost importance. Their navigation routes were then linked to the sequence in which they took off and their position in the formation of aircraft that were flying over the target. So at this point, they're all queued up and ready to go. After the briefing, the aircraft are concurrently prepared at the same time. This shows one of the aircraft from 467 Squadron. It's preserved today in the museum, in the Royal Air Force Museum in London. It's survived 137 missions over hostile territory. And when I describe further the events, you just wonder that any of them managed to do that. It's carrying a significant bomb load. That great big cylinder at the front is a 4,000-pound bomb, and they had another 16 smaller ones with it. So you've got an aircraft full of fuel, full of bombs. It's a very dangerous piece of equipment to everybody, because the risk of things going wrong, aircraft blowing up on the ground, all of which happened, was just an ever-present part of the daily occurrence of these guys. So from here, they'd once all the briefings and everything are completed, they'd have dinner, because they're going out at night. Now, the term Last Supper gets used all the time, and for many of them, it was. This is one of the crews from that night's raid. The call sign was Papa Oscar Bravo, or B for Baker, as they called it in those days. Those 7 men were about to get into that darkened aircraft and head off. In the immediate lead up, the pilot and flight engineer, you see them there, would carry out all their pre-flight checks and so on. And then each of the crew members had their allotted tasks. There's a bomb aimer right up the front. There's the navigator and wireless operator, and then there's 2 gunners, one at the top and one at the back. This raid was scheduled for a takeoff at 2200 that night, and they took off in sequence, some of the aircraft as late as 10:30, and they were on their way. There's a fantastic description given by a pilot who took part in that raid. His name was Phil Smith. I won't go through the detail of that, but this will be published in due course, and his description of that process is very poignant and engaging. But consider this: you're one of these 7 guys, you climb into your aircraft, and for the rest of the trip, you don't actually have any contact with the other crew, apart from the intercom, which is kept to a minimum. So pilot and engineer, we've already seen. The navigator and wireless operator down there bottom right, mid-upper gunner in that little blister on the top of the aircraft, and the worst job in the Air Force, I think, at the time, the rear gunner. And you see over there on the left, he's sitting there behind 4 machine guns at the back end of the aircraft with a radar transmitter that he doesn't realise the enemy can detect. And away they go. Now, the next thing, of course, is it's at night. No one's displaying lights. So they've got to be very aware of the presence of other aircraft. The risk of collision is very high, and it took out a lot more aircraft than you'd imagine. But they're on their way. They crossed the coast. That was all relatively uneventful. Lille's not far away from the coastline, and they came over it fairly quickly, but things had started to go wrong. The target marking that they were relying on hadn't worked properly. The first aircraft over the target had dropped their bombs and it had extinguished the markers. So the most dreaded command in any of these sorts of operations then took place. The master bomber, the guy in charge of the whole thing, said, right, stop, we've got to circle and then wait for the target to be remarked again, which they did. If you read the diaries of these men, nothing freaked them out more than having to circle and wait to go over the target. All they wanted to do was get there, drop their bombs and get the hell out of there. And at this point, it's when things started to go wrong. So 11:30, they were over the target. They were told to stop at 20 minutes to midnight, and only a few aircraft had actually bombed by that stage. Then it really started to go pear-shaped. That time allowed the defences to consolidate. Irrespective of that, though, I mean, in researching this, I found some just amazing resources. And this is a map put together by the French Civil Defence of their objective, which was the rail yards in Lille. And you can see the accuracy is not bad under the circumstances, because everybody in the world down there was shooting at them, and they had to contend with the risk of hitting each other and the danger of night fighters. But they dropped their bombs with pretty good precision. However, there were still nearly 200 French casualties, but none of which they were aware of at the time, of course. So they resumed bombing at 10 to midnight, but by that stage, things had really started to hot up, and very quickly it took an enormous toll amongst the attacking aircraft. The descriptions are fairly limited. Most of the logbooks are quite terse and matter of fact, but we have one surviving very detailed description. And as it happens, from the man I mentioned earlier, his takeoff description, it was so poignant. He was the only survivor from 12 aircraft lost that night. So that in a very short period of time, 10 Lancasters were lost over the target. I'm going to just touch briefly on those now, and I'm focusing on the Australians, bearing in mind that they represented about a third of the attacking force at this particular occasion. Okay, so what I've tried to do here is just display the crew. You'll see that the dark blue is Royal Australian Air Force, the pale blue is Royal Air Force. Despite the fact that it was notionally an Australian squadron, the crews in all these aircraft were generally mixed, and you could have, you know, individuals from all over the Commonwealth. In the Australian squadrons, there was a higher percentage, and as you can see in this case, they're 4 in number of the crew of 7. The next thing to notice is the age. So these guys are very young men. Okay, so the first aircraft, and I'm using the descriptor up the top, that's the call sign. That's how they identified themselves, and they would generally regularly fly in the same aircraft. So this particular one, Juliet Oscar November, is from 463 Squadron. It's got the signifies Juliet Oscar. Their aircraft crashed pretty much on the edge of the railway yards. What happened here is these aircraft are described as exploding in midair. So that's going to be, well, unsurvivable, and that's what happened. In fact, in this case, the rear gunner at Royal Air Force guy, his remains were never recovered, and that story is going to repeat itself. This photo just always amazes me. Look at the age and the face on the pilot. These guys most of these guys started their training 19, and by this stage they grew up very quickly. That is a very unusual shot in the background there of the whole crew. And the numbers correspond with the numbers behind the names on the left. This one again was seen to explode, or several were seen to explode, but this was one of them. Now I'll plot all the locations in a second. But again, no survivors. The aircraft were breaking up. It was raining aircraft parts and bodies, pretty much. So it's a pretty violent but very quick way to end your life. This is the one about which we know the most. The pilot, Phil Smith, was the only survivor. Now, this is all happening within a few minutes of one another. That's what I'm trying to convey here. So the target's on fire. There's anti-aircraft fire going everywhere. Because of the confusion created by the delay, there's aircraft going So Smith describes they were actually in the process of releasing their bombs when the next thing he knew was the aircraft just disintegrated around him. He was lucky. They just changed procedure. So he was actually sitting on and strapped into his parachute, which was incorporated in his seat. Most of the other guys have to actually locate their parachute and put it on. And when things are going that bad, that quickly, that is not going to happen. So Smith finds himself in midair, still in his seat, and he was able to release himself from the seat, pull his ripcord, and then discover that one of the risers was almost cut through. He managed to descend, missing a boot, and landed on the ground in the middle of all of this, but then he escaped and was able to evade capture for 4 months. He hooked up with the French resistance. But he was not able to relate accurately what happened to their aircraft. Was it hit by anti-aircraft fire? Very possible, and it could well have detonated the bombs. By a fighter? Not likely, because they're at risk from their own flak straight over the target and the falling bombs. And the collision is the other most likely, and we've inferred that that's in fact what happened. They got hit by another aircraft without ever seeing it. Again, all those men were lost, and except for Smith. Another aircraft, and this one, the wreckage landed in pretty much the same area as the one I just described, B for Baker. So this is J for Juliet. Again, this is 5 of the 7 crew are RAAF. Again, no survivors. What I've done with this one here is try to plot the location of each of these aircraft. This is a pretty small area. We're talking probably 3 Ks from left to right, as you see where the aircraft are plotted. This was an all-Australian crew. There's a South Australian in amongst them, the bomb aimer, a guy named Lloyd Mackenzie. He'd been the town clerk of Owen up in the lower mid-north before the war. Again, the ages, there's a few older guys amongst these, but by and large, the pilots are nearly always very early 20s. This description exploded in a huge explosion is just persistent. The other thing that crews describe are seeing what they call scarecrows, and they believe these to be anti-aircraft shells that exploded to create the impression of an aircraft blowing up. Sadly, after the war, they found out that no such thing existed. What they were seeing was aircraft blowing up, and with it taking its 7-member crew to their deaths. Now, I mentioned that in the space of about 25 minutes, 10 aircraft were lost over the target. The ones that had completed bombing were on their way home. And now I just want to reconnect the story with my Belgian friend. 2 more aircraft were to be lost, and this is Juliet Oscar Juliet, JOJ. It's the one that landed in Conrad's grandfather's brickyard, as it happened. So they're flying home. They probably think, well, we've made it. We're out of the target area. And then they were intercepted and engaged by a German night fighter using exactly that equipment I described before. And it was able to get underneath the aircraft. It can't be detected. The blister you see on the bottom of the Lancaster there is actually a radar, but it doesn't detect the aircraft. And they've got no one looking down just because of the configuration of the plane. So the first thing they knew about it would have been being ripped to bits by 20mm cannon fire, which would be, it's explosive, it's destructive, it'll ignite fuel, and it will certainly rip through the aircraft. And in a matter of moments, it too broke up and crashed. So a bit more geography. Just below this, the ring there circles a town called Langemark, which is where the brickyard is. There below that is Ypres, and Lille is off further to the southeast, to the lower right. Another British Lancaster was shot down near here as well, but it's this one that we're going to focus on now because of the circumstances around which I became aware of it. So here's the crew. There's 2 South Australians in it, David Croston and Bob Croft. The captain was Mervyn Powell. He was an agronomist who'd been working in Fiji before the war. But by this stage, he's a decorated, very experienced pilot. And both Croston and Croft had extensive experience as well. These guys were on their 15th mission, so they were halfway through their tour. Bob Croft had already completed one earlier in the war, as had Merv Powell. Okay, so I described what happened in the air, but then the next, I guess, description is picked up by Conrad's father, Antoon, who was a young man of 19 at the time the aircraft crashed. They were called out. They couldn't leave their houses. They could hear this. They could hear the machine gun fire and then the explosion, but they were forbidden to leave their homes by the Nazi occupiers. But next morning, police came round and grabbed him because he was, you know, the son of the owner, and out they went to the site. So it's a brickyard. It's full of water. They'd closed it down at the start of the war when the Nazi occupiers turned up, so they couldn't use it. The aircraft had come down in several pieces, and they've got the photograph. They're pretty confronting, which is why I haven't published them here. But the bodies of some of the crew were found immediately, and then others, in particular, I'm pretty sure it would have been David Croston. He was trapped in the rear fuselage of the aircraft, which was actually submerged. But Antoon, Conrad's father, provided a very detailed description of what they found, and then how the process was actually managed then by the Germans, who treated all the bodies and so on with the greatest of respect, which I suppose might provide some small comfort for the families, of course. Anyway, the essence of all this, I mentioned Mervyn Powell. David Croston was he was well known in rowing circles in Adelaide. He was a leader, a very significant player in the Port Adelaide Rowing Club, and was very well known. Bob Croft, he joined the Air Force very early on and was flying in the very early stages of the war. Born in Evandale in the eastern suburbs, but he was living at Cherryville at the time. Now, I literally just went up there this morning because I've been searching for photos of these guys because it just so much better identifies. It's not just a name. And I found Bob Croft's photo by looking up the Virtual War Memorial. And here's a little board up in a tiny little community hall at Cherryville. So I drove up there literally this morning and was able to get that photo. There's a number of others there as well. You just can't help but be moved by the circumstances of these guys. They spend 3 or 4 years. They get into these aircraft every night knowing that their chances of surviving a full mission are less than even. It's just it just makes you wonder about the psychology of what was going on in their minds at the time. The guys that I've just described weren't the only ones. There were other Australians lost in aircraft. As I said, they were posted to RAF squadrons. So there were 2 in number 9 squadron in one aircraft. You can see them there, Hugh Campbell and Bert Tyne. And then another aircraft, Walter White. So again, they were both lost over the target area. And then the last one, number 97 squadron, was actually the Pathfinder force. Their job was to get there first, mark the targets, very high risk. They had all sorts of sophisticated equipment, but as I inferred before, it's active emission. It sends out a signal which can be detected, tracked, and used to intercept them. So the Pathfinder force loss rates were really high. In this case, they didn't lose any aircraft that night, but Henry Ward was right out of luck. His aircraft got hit by anti-aircraft fire over Belgium. He was critically wounded, and he died before they landed. So that totaled up 32 Australians out of a total of 85 people. So these 2 squadrons shared the same base and the messes and all that sort of stuff. So the next morning at breakfast, they're missing 49 men. And it was the single worst night of the war. Often they'd lose 1, maybe 2. They've even lost 5 on a number of occasions. But to lose 6 aircraft between them, it was unprecedented. And fortunately for them, it didn't happen again. So what's the wash up of all of this? Well, there's a lot of graves in the very grounds or the area that their fathers had fought over just 26 years before. I had never appreciated that until doing the research on the background of this. So I'll certainly be making efforts to get to some of these, just to pay my respects to a bunch of very brave men indeed. The circumstances about which caused these losses were never fully known, of course, because no one lived to tell the tale, and certainly relate it to the intelligence staff and so on back in England. But they did become progressively aware of some of the threats they faced. But the aircraft using these upward firing cannon were really deadly, and the Allies did not twig to it until after D-Day, when a German night fighter pilot landed on a captured airfield by mistake. And then it was the first time that they realised what was causing some of these losses. But that's the nature of warfare, and it's horrendous when you think about the scale of losses. Just to put this in some kind of perspective, of all the losses that Australia sustained in World War II, it was about 39,000, which is 2/3 of what we lost in the First World War. But the biggest single cohort of losses were amongst these men, the men who were recruited into the Air Force and sent under the Empire Air Training Scheme to Britain. Their loss rates were high both in training, but particularly on operations. And for men to survive one tour, let alone in some cases two, is just, the odds against that are enormous. So you can only marvel at their fortitude, their resilience, their allegiance to one another, because really it was the crew that they lived, worked, and sadly often died with that sustained them through all of this. And yet, you know, they were matched up with people that they never would have met under any other circumstances. The fact that they were able to function as well as they did, it's just an extraordinary tale of what people are capable of. Most of these men came from very ordinary backgrounds. They were reasonably well educated. They had to be to get through all the training and the screening and so on and so forth. But it always, when I read these accounts, it just leaves me marvelling at what they did. So there's one last closing comment, which as a soldier and a one-time infantryman, I really appreciated. One of the aircrew asked, you know, well, how did you sort of live through all of this? And his comment was, well, look, we took the view that the end, if it came, would come quickly. But if it didn't, we'd have bacon and eggs for breakfast and we get to sleep in clean sheets. And it trivialises what they went through, but it did offer part, I guess, of the sort of philosophy. It was living in the now. They didn't think too much about what was happening tomorrow. It was just get through this one and we'd do it all over again. So every year when we come to reflect on Anzac Day, we've tended to focus on the First World War. But given we're in the 80th anniversary period of these events now, it does, we should pause for reflection on what happened in a subsequent war, and in this case, not very far from where their fathers had fought 26 years before. Lest we forget. Thank you. I'll take questions. I'll just get out of here now, out of the screen. Oh, just before I do sign off, back in Australia, the guys in Europe were called odd bods and Jap dodgers, which just goes to point out that they had absolutely no idea of what was going on over there. Right, on that note.
Would you like me to stop the sharing of the screen?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that right now. Hang on.
I've done it for you.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, terrific, Steve. Let's get some questions, and the first one comes from our president.
Yes, Steve, my question is, you know, that reference that you made earlier about the age of some of this, of the pilots in particular. Was that strategic? Was that, because, you know, if you look at Formula One, for example, as a sport, but most other activity that are at high risk, when you're younger, you don't regard your life, you know, you have a propensity for risk that is a lot higher. So if you've got a family, kids, you know, a lot of experience, you probably look at this very differently than if you're 20. So I'm wondering whether it was just a scarcity or whether there was a strategic decision to recruit younger people that would have risked, that put at risk, you know, they would have put their life at risk easier, in an easier way.
That's a pretty good point, Adri. And look, they used to go through a very detailed screening process. When all these guys turned up, they'd get put through a whole series of intermediate steps, and those selections would be made continuously. Then they had to get through their training. I think you're right. When you're younger, you don't calculate the risks in quite the same way. And I'm sure that was a factor. What's interesting is that Australians represented about 5% of the total air crews over there. We trained something like 27,000 men all around Australia. There's little airfields everywhere, all over Western New South Wales. There was about 5 here in South Australia. And they churned these blokes off to Europe. And then, of course, when Japan ended the war, they all got pretty, well, not all, but they still kept sending lots over there. But the attrition rate for pilots was nearly 50%. In other words, they'd get cut and then redirected into some other stream. Like most navigators were pilots who got scrubbed. Same with the bomb owners. Whereas gunners and wireless operators used to get selected for different aptitudes. Wireless operators had to be able to, you know, get and work with Morse code and things like that. But when you're a pilot, yeah, you're right. They've got a much higher level of risk acceptance. And sometimes you need that just to get through the threats that are posed.
Yeah. Great question. Next question, and perhaps a wine commentary, is from Jeff Pitt. Well, unmute yourself, Jeff. It's all right. You need to unmute yourself, Jeff.
Doing that now.
That's great. Good.
Peter, it's a very nice Charlie Melton, 9 Popes, 2002, because of the significance of what we're dealing with here today. And Steve, excellent and outstanding presentation. And perhaps you and I need to have a bit of a discussion, because my father was one of the 1 in 3 survivors of Bomber Command, and he flew in 467 Squadron as a wireless navigator. And the things that you were talking about today are actually a bit familiar to me. And possibly I could show people that is the 467 Squadron logo with the Kingfisher.
Fantastic.
That is a photo of the POM Lancaster that he and his crew flew more than 1.5 sorties on. They survived one and then were put into another. And he also won the French Legion of Honour, awarded by the French government, which is the highest award you can get for his contribution to the survival of France. But there is what I think would be interesting. I mean, I've got lots of stories, but I never realised until he was a lot older that, and I was in France at a city called Caen, C-A-E-N, which was...
Know it well.
And I rang him, and because I'd found out that the city of Caen had been obliterated on just after D-Day. And the reason it was obliterated was that the Germans had absolutely the stronghold there, and the pincer movement down through France wasn't working, and the Canadians were totally blocked with the English, and there was one town that had to go. And so out of Waddington, a Bomber Command group had to go and obliterate the town of Caen, which they did, and that's how D-Day progressed from there on. So that's probably why they got the French Legion of Honour as a group for doing that, but quite special. But in Waddington itself, which I was there in 2018, they have a the RAF, which is still an operating base. The V bombers worked out of there, and now it's a drone. And they used to bomb Afghanistan from there. But I talked my way in, and there's a beautiful RAF Lancaster museum there, which is fantastic. So if anybody ever wants to go to England and look at the war, Waddington's got some pretty special stuff. Excellent presentation, Steve, but I have to have another drink now, Peter.
Thanks,
well
Jeff,
done.
that was fantastic.
Jeff,
There's a tremendous blog that if you've got a connection with 467 Squadron, I can point you to. And I've made contact with the author. Young guy, young enough to be my son, but he's done a wonderful job.
No, there's still a few of them sitting around 463, 467s, and they had some pretty good events in over the years.
Yeah, well, this chap, Adam Purcell, has actually captured a lot of those stories, which you think about it, in the space of the last 10 years, a lot of these men have gone, and with them goes that sort of detailed knowledge. And that's really what the virtual memorial's about. We want to capture that stuff, relate it to people, relate it to places, events, and the units that were formed.
I think I can get you to a man who came down in a Lancaster. He was a wireless operator. It was so bad, the whole crew survived because of him getting them back to England. And it was only in about 5 years ago, he was awarded the highest medal at the presentation by Cosgrove in Canberra.
Fantastic.
Because they could not award it to him when he was injured in England. They didn't do it. So later in life, he managed to get the highest award he could ever possibly get.
Fantastic insight, Jeff, and thank you for sharing that. My uncle, Lance, served in the same squadron and flew a Lancaster on D-Day. But the other observation that you made, I'll touch on. Our good friend and good friend of Steve, Tom Maxwell, was actually a navigator on V bombers from Waddington.
It's a pretty special place.
Yeah.
I just seen a note here too. Elizabeth Davis's father was an air gunner wireless operator. And she's just said here, I'll be populating the virtual war memorial. Well done. Look, if you've got those stories and got that information, please get on there and have a look. She also mentioned he trained at Mount Gambier. It was a key training base, and I must say, not the world's best flying conditions down there, particularly in winter, and quite a dangerous place to be on some occasions.
I'm casting my eye around. I can't see any hands waving. Nothing on the chat room. Anybody got a question? Unmute yourself and yell out, please.
It's Stephen Noble here.
Stephen?
I think members of our club have heard me speak previously on the occasion of this Anzac Day, or pre-Anzac Day address as it is today. But today I was particularly interested, not realising what Steve Larkins was going to be talking about, but I think I've previously shared that my uncle, who was my mother's only other sibling, was an upper turret gunner on the Lancasters during the Battle of Britain, and he flew a lot of missions. In fact, he shared with me a couple of things, and sadly he passed away 18 months ago, that my uncle Des won the Distinguished Flying Cross in his role, and then he also, like Jeff's father, he was decorated by the French only a couple of years ago. They actually came out from France and found a few survivors, so I think it was the same medal. My uncle Des, on retirement, became a senior English master, which is quite a contrast from his youth. So he was telling me that he was, and I don't quite know how many bombing missions or how many terms they did, but he was taken out of the bombers before he was 21. He was actually on the train going into London when he suddenly realised it was his 21st birthday. So they were so incredibly young. The other thing I'll just share with you is, because I've asked him this, when you get back to your base and then you see the empty beds next and around you in the dormitories, what do you think? And he said, well, we don't automatically assume that everyone else that isn't there is deceased. And the reason for that is they had many airstrips, and a lot of planes might have had a problem with an engine or something, and so they might go to a different airstrip. And so they weren't certain that, you know, Fred or Bill didn't get back. They just didn't know. Yes, there'd be less people in their dormitory that night and maybe at breakfast the next morning. They just didn't know, and I think they didn't think about it. You might recall we had a speaker some years ago who wrote that book, And They Hosed Them Out, and that was an Adelaide guy who put that book together. And again, that was probably talking about the rear turret gunners on the Lancasters, and it's a good book to read if you haven't read it, because it's quite startling, I don't know if it's the heroism or just the sheer lack of fear. And I think Adriano referred to that too, that when they're young, that they see no fear. And apparently for males back in that era, 27 is about the age that people started to think maybe they were mortal rather than immortal. But anyway, thank you again, Steve. I thought it was excellent. While you were talking, I had my phone up and I was taking photos and sending to my cousin, who's a now retired lawyer in Sydney. It was his father that, and we were only chatting last night about something else to do with our family. So incredibly coincidental and excellent. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Terrific, Steve. Thank you, Stephen. Just maybe send your cousin a link for this, the YouTube video of today's meeting. Steve, I can't see any hands waving. David, I'll get to you in 2 seconds, but while we get to David Egan, interesting couple of comments there. You mentioned in your presentation, and Stephen Noble's just raised the issue of the tail gunner. My best mate's father in Brisbane in the 60s always walked with a shuffle, and I always wondered what it was about. And he was a tail gunner in Lancaster, and the turret pivoted, and before they bailed out, they actually had to pivot round, get their parachute, put it on, then pivot back the other way so they could fall out into thin air. And Merv did this, and he landed, and he was a prisoner of war and was forced route marched halfway across Belgium and France, and in flying boots, because they wore lambswool leather boots with no padding, with just padding and warmth, no
proper sole. No.
Proper sole, and poor old Merv's feet were never the same. David Egan.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Just thanks again, Stephen, for a wonderful presentation, and also congratulations again on the wonderful virtual war memorial, which was your idea. Can you just give us a brief update on how it's going, the virtual war memorial, any new progress or where it's heading to, and also what they got planned for Saturday? Because I know Nick's working his beaver off at the moment in the background, putting things up for Saturday morning.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. If you look at the virtual war memorial at the moment and the state RSL's website, obviously with no dawn services and so on going on, they are promoting the proposition that people get out at 6 o'clock in their driveway, tuned into the ABC, and they'll be broadcasting the very limited dawn service that's been conducted in the city. I know there's a lot of people. I'm involved with the Rose Park Memorial. We're not having an official service, but Reverend Beth Seaman, who looks after the church at Gartrell Church alongside the memorial, and I will be doing a vigil at 6 o'clock. We've got people who normally lay wreaths will be coming throughout the day to do so. But all the while, we're promoting the notion of, and by the way, the Rose Park Memorial are heavily into the virtual war memorial. We're actually working on doing a broadcast, not a broadcast, but a projection of images of the people on that memorial onto the wall of the church in the future. So, and there's a lot of places all up and down the state who are using it in some form or another to support services and so on this Anzac Day or commemoration. The big thing we're going to be doing, I mean, we're an online medium, and Zoom and other facilities like it present great opportunities to engage. I'm currently working with a group up in the hills, kids from Loberthal, Gumaraka, all affected by the Cuddly Creek fires and so on. Well, they're home in lockdown at the moment, and we're working very closely with those folks. They're running a competition to investigate people from the community and so on. Perhaps Bob Croft will get a run, because there's little memorials like that all through the hills and all through the state and across the country. So we just want to ensure that that information is not lost. It's connected, joined up with the existing records, and where possible, we add the depth of personal anecdote, their diaries, reflections, and even remembrances or the memories of people like us, their kids, and so on and so forth. So that's what it's all about. In the big picture, funding's always an issue, and the big limitation is we never did get resourced adequately to upload all the World War II and subsequent conflict information interstate. We've got the whole suite here in South Australia because the South Australian RSL at the time resourced it. But we're beavering away, and that's one of the key objectives. We have huge engagement. There's 656,000 names on the memorial now. The scary thing is the target is 1.6 million. It can be done. The data model's good, it's robust, and we haven't had any major issues with it in that regard. It's just about getting contributions and so on from people and awareness. It's got a very good level of awareness in South Australia. We've got work to do elsewhere. Most of you would be aware that David's son Nick has been working with the VWM for a number of years now, and he and another young man named Ned Young have done a power of work in the process of getting Facebook and everything positioned to support all the other forthcoming dawn service activities. There was a great spread in the Advertiser yesterday on Ned, and he's a young intern. He's generating some wonderful work, and we've got a very active schools program across the states. So look, probably as good as it can be under the circumstances. There's always room. It's all about funding, you know, and you're in constant competition with a million other things to get it. But the lockdowns presented a few challenges. We can't run any of the normal fundraising events that we normally do, but we'll
Thanks, Steve.
We'll get through it. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, David, for raising that. I'm sorry, there's just somebody in. Yeah, a couple of people have joined us. Good to see the competition between Paul Denver and Tony Milne for the most sartorial turnout. Who's wearing football shorts? Jill Chapman's been doing some arm stretches in her car. David Mottram is kicking back at the beach again. It's lovely to see everybody, and we sort of see a number of people online joining us. Julie Campbell is there. Mike Stevens has joined us. Frank is there. No, Margaret's drinking the red wine. And Dean Brazier appears to have a rather spiffy looking top on. Anyway, it's great to see everybody. Steve, thank you for that presentation. It was terrific as usual and your usual standard. The reflections that you provided, I know and can obviously see the members and guests have listened intently and appreciated sharing your knowledge as we lead into Anzac Day, and Rajiv has kindly put a nice backdrop to his photo about Anzac Day. Steve, as usual on the online presentations, we don't forget our certificates, and if I can just manoeuvre myself to make sure that it's, well, you can, it's back.
I get the idea. Thank you.
A certificate of appreciation, and for all those who've joined us from day one on the online meetings, all of the speakers have received their certificates in the mail. Steve, thank you. And can I get Adri to unmute everybody and ask all the members to show their appreciation for your informative address. Well done, and back to the central commentary position to President Adri.
Yes, I thank you very much, Steve. Your passion and knowledge is evident as you seem to elevate to higher place anytime you are covering these topics. It's fantastic. Thank you. A special thank you to everyone else as well connected, and Peter has already touched on many of you. It's fantastic to see you joining us and able to join us, and we hope to see you again back next week. Next week, we will be back online and our guest speaker will be Professor Ruth Rentschler, OAM. Her topic will be Gender and Ethnic Diversity on Arts Boards. Does policy follow practice or practice follow policy? I will now close today's meeting. Thank you all for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week.